Hello and welcome to What's New in Veeam Backup and Replication v12, Enhancing Data Protection and Security. Today's webinar is sponsored by Veeam and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this especially timely presentation. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. The Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Second, in your handouts section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. I'd especially like to call your attention to 4 resources from Veeam. There's a free demo of the Veeam Data Platform, a new trial for the Veeam Data Platform, a technical demo of that platform, and a link to VeeamON 2023, Veeam's action-packed annual conference. So I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and your colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar event, we'll be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Now, finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenter. And to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. After the event is over, we'll look at all the questions that came in, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today, Matt Crape, who's Senior Technical Product Manager at Veeam. And I will turn things over to Matt.
Hi there, folks. Thanks for joining me today for our webinar, Enhancing Data Protection and Security. My name is Matt Crape. I'm a Senior Technical Product Marketer here at Veeam. And today we wanted to take a few minutes to go through and discuss some of the improvements, enhancements, changes that have been released with the Veeam Data Platform with the recent v12 release, but put a little bit of extra focus on the security aspect. So, I appreciate you joining today. I'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A. I'll try to answer what I can, but a lot of that will likely happen towards the end of the webinar. So for the time being, let's get started. Whenever I start talking about, whether it's security or anything really, I always like to sort of address the why. Why do we care about this? Well, unfortunately, outages and data loss are a reality. Many customers, many enterprises, large or small, this is something that we all face to one degree or another. What's interesting is some of you may be familiar with the Veeam Data Trends Report. It's a report that we publish every year now for the past several years. What's interesting about this report is we actually work with a third-party company and they contact, customers, end users, organizations of all sizes, completely independent from Veeam. So they may be Veeam customers, they may not be. The point that I'm driving at is it's one of the largest, surveys within the industry that we really try to use to get data. What are things really like in the field? What's startling is with the recent release for the 2023 report is we see that 85% of companies have been hit with ransomware in one form or another, at least once. Many of them have been hit multiple times. What's somewhat frightening is that number is actually up from the previous year. It was formerly in the mid 70s and now it's gone up to the mid 80s. Along with that, some of the challenges that come with it is 82% of companies say that they have to do some sort of manual process to actually recover their data after an outage. This could range from something like, hey, we need to go drive to, the vault to go pick up tapes. That's a manual process. Or maybe it's a matter of, we don't have the hardware to restore to, we need to order it, we need to manually provision it. Whatever that is. Unfortunately, when you're doing things like this in a non-automated fashion, it's not only a matter of losing out on time savings, there's also the human aspect to it. It becomes error prone all of a sudden. When you're doing a repetitive task, it's all too easy to miss a step, which can add further delays. Another interesting stat that was pulled from this is that 46% of companies intend to use cloud services as their DR site. This might include, cloud infrastructure or perhaps disaster recovery as a service. So why is this interesting? Well, it shows a real shift in the mentality around disaster recovery. A lot of us, who have been in the field for a long time, we think back to the days where DR meant that you had to have a second site with like-to-like hardware, something to restore back to. Maybe it was a warm site, maybe it was a cold site. You always had to have those conversations with the business saying, yes, we actually want to buy duplicate hardware and hope that we never have to use it. It became a very hard sell. You usually had to start talking about what's the value to the business. Clouds changed a significant portion of that. Right now, you're able to change that CapEx into a bit of an OpEx, which might make things easier to swallow. Similarly, maybe it's a matter of, we only pay for what we need. We can start budgeting, doing our DR testing. And at the end of the day, it's a matter of we're not laying out all this money for something that we hope that we never need to use. So that flexibility is definitely something that we're seeing more and more of. But with that, there come challenges. As your workload spread, as your data spreads, where it's sitting, security is always top of mind. One of the things that we do here at Veeam is we try to incorporate these 3 pillars into everything that we do, from a data protection standpoint to making sure that your organization is back up and running. A lot of it could be fit into one of these 3 pillars, which you'll find throughout all of our products. You've got things like data security. How do we ensure that your data remains safe? What can we do? Recovery. Obviously, recovery is one of our key components that we work on. But at the end of the day, it's really the recovery that matters. Yes, backups could be as simple as just copying a file. That's technically a backup. What really matters is the recovery. Is the data there when you need it? Does it work as expected? Are you running into any errors? And lastly, data freedom. What does that mean? That actually means quite a few different things. On the one hand, your backup software shouldn't dictate where your workloads can or can't run, right? You shouldn't say, no, we can't use cloud because we can't protect it. On the same token, it should also allow you the freedom to restore your data wherever you need to. Maybe it's a matter of, we have these physical servers, they died. Maybe they were under a pipe in the data center that burst. How do we get our workloads back up and running? You should be able to restore them, whether to a virtual or to a cloud. And at the same time, you shouldn't necessarily have your data held hostage. What I mean by that is anyone who's used Veeam for any length of time, you might be familiar with the concept of the extract utility, for example. All this really means is at any point in time, you can actually get your data back out of a Veeam backup file at no cost. You could go download the extract utility, pull your data out, or you can even just go download a version of Veeam Community Edition if you find yourself in the bind and you need to get that data. So there's no lock-in, and that's kind of what we mean by data freedom. How do these 3 pillars translate to our recent release? Well, I'm not going to read through each of these, but at a high level, some of these new features, some of these enhancements kind of speak to the mindset that we're going with here. So things like data security, right? Direct to object storage, that's a big one, and I'll dive into that a bit deeper shortly here. Data recovery, right? You want to make sure that you can respond fast. You shouldn't be in a situation, alluding to the reports earlier, where yeah, we could have moved faster, but we had to do all these manual processes. You should be able to react quickly to get your business back up and running quickly. Lastly, data freedom, right? Being able to take your workloads and run them wherever you want to, or possibly wherever you need to, having that flexibility. So let's dig in a little bit here. Let's talk about, safeguarding your data. What does this mean? The backups are your last line of defense when it comes to any sort of disaster. You need to make sure that they're safe. In today's world, in a lot of situations when you're being attacked, whether by a malicious insider, ransomware, threat actor, whatever, quite often they'll go right after your backups. Why is that? Well, because once you knock out the backups, if you move on to knocking out production workloads, there's nothing left to restore from. That makes it all the more pertinent that you need to safeguard this stuff. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have your backups, you're probably more likely to being forced to pay the ransom. So what can we do to protect our backups? A lot of you have probably heard about this term immutability. The concept itself actually is not new, but it's gained so much traction in the past few years, largely due in part to ransomware attacks. So what is it, right? It's the ability to essentially lock a file so that it can't be altered. So if it's sitting on immutable storage, that means it can't be encrypted by ransomware. It means it can't be deleted, and it safeguards it. So that's part of the reason why it's appealing. But what other reasons might there be? Data integrity and compliance is a big one. If you work for a financial institution or possibly some other heavily regulated industry, it's not uncommon to have the requirement to actually store data for X number of years, decades, in some cases, maybe indefinitely. You need a way to ensure that when you put the data on the disk, it does not get altered by any means. As I mentioned, it's resilient against malware attacks, right? If it's already written to there, it can't be altered, right? Your backups are safe. The ransomware cannot touch it. And at the end of the day, we're all human. Putting it on there can reduce the risk from human error, right? We've all seen it before where someone deletes the wrong backup job, for example, right? You don't want to lose all those retention points. So having an extra safeguard in place can really make a lot of sense. But it doesn't come out with some important considerations. Well, first off, there's multiple ways to achieve immutability. As I mentioned, object storage is a big one these days. Part of the reason for that is it's very easy to work with. If you're using something like S3 or S3 compatible object storage, whether on premises or in the cloud, you could probably leverage just S3 object lock technology, which is built right into it. Very simple to work with, straightforward. With v12, you can leverage Azure Blob immutability if you want to use that as a place to go back to. But let's not forget about some of the original forms of immutability. Tape backup, for example. For years and years, decades now, you've been able to purchase what's called write once, read many tape media, also known as worm. What this would do is it would write it to disk, and then you couldn't change it. Saw a lot of use for compliance and regulations and so forth. But that technology still exists. For those of you old enough like me, it's very similar to back in the day. You'd pop a tape, make your mixtape, pop into the Walkman, listen to it. You don't want to accidentally record over it, so you break the little tabs, right? Now, granted, worm media is a little different. You can't just put tape over the tab to write to it again, but the concept's the same. Something else to consider is just because the file can't be changed, it doesn't actually necessarily prevent data leakage. That file could still be copied. So you still want to make sure that you're monitoring access to this, right? Paying attention to who's accessing it and why. There's nothing to stop someone from exfiltrating this data. And I'll touch on that a little bit later because there are things we can still do to protect that. And lastly, something that I stress so heavily is make sure you ensure proper sizing, right? Do the math. What do I mean by this? Say, for example, you're speccing out a new repository and you say, yes, let's make these backups immutable for 90 days. I want to make sure that we're safeguarded for the short term. Well, you get 45 days in and you realize that you've used 90% of the capacity. What do? You can't delete the files on there already. You're going to run out of space. How you solve that problem? Chances are it's going to cost you money in some form. If you're using a cloud provider, well, your usage is going to go up. If you're doing something on premises, You might need to talk to your storage provider about, hey, how do we actually get more capacity in here? So make sure you understand the math behind this and find a value that works for you. With V12, we've got some, very comprehensive immutability options available. So you'll see on the slide here, we're kind of talking about the architecture behind a scale-out backup repository. So there's lots of options that you could use here as far as designing this. On the left-hand side, you've got your repositories. This is where the data could be written directly to. You'll see that we've got S3 compatible, we've got hardened Linux repository, tape, and so forth. Now, just because they support immutability doesn't mean that you actually have to use it here. It's highly recommended for short term, but every use case is different. From there, you could shift things off to the capacity tier. So think about short-term storage to short to mid-term storage being the capacity tier here. Once again, lots of options available, whether on premises or in the cloud. And lastly, for the long-term retention, you can leverage things like S3 Glacier or Azure Archive Blob Storage. Something for the longer, hey, we want to keep this for X number of years. Once again, think about the math on this. Do you actually need every restore point? Maybe you just want to send your once a month there and have 12 copies there for a year. Figure out what the business needs, what the application owners need, do the math on that, figure out the cost, and start from there. So not shown on the slide is just kind of the regular non-scale out backup repositories. Lots of support there. Once again, if you want to write directly to a Linux hardened repository or S3 compatible storage, that's entirely possible now as well with V12. From a NAS backup perspective, once again, more improvements. Immutability is supported as well. So in this example, you'll see we're backing up a NAS from local on-premises to public cloud. What are the benefits of doing this? Well, you may want to send it off to the public cloud for, once again, the longer term retention. Maybe you've got a small enough data set that this is what makes sense, or maybe that's just how it was set up for you before. With this release, we've got like the helper appliances, which are fantastic resource to use when it comes to things like backup chain transformations and health checks. So these helper appliances typically work around optimizing CPU intensive tasks, right? With the intent of not sending data back and forth, egressing from the public cloud back to the local infrastructure, but rather all that's happening on the remote end. So this has the side effect of basically being much more efficient, and it's going to save you some cash because you're not sending data back and forth. Similarly, depending on your network infrastructure, maybe you've got specific gateways that you want to use. You can also leverage the object storage gateway server, right, to send traffic directly through there. There's nothing to say that you can't use a local object storage repository either for this setup. You absolutely can. You can send it there, once again, configure immutability as you see fit, and keep going. With V12, there's actually been some tremendous enhancements with the tape engine. In fact, it's almost closer to a complete rewrite versus what was there prior. So in a nutshell, the tape engine was originally designed to move Veeam backup files to tape for storage for archiving purposes. Its use changed, especially after we introduced NAS support. We found that sometimes users were actually just backing up directly from NAS to tape, which isn't really what it was designed for. So with V12, there's been a tremendous overhaul in the tape engine, lots of optimizations, scalability, performance, and so forth. But specifically with NAS backup to tape, you can now send your NAS backups directly to tape if you choose to. So this has the benefit of not taking up space on local repositories that you may have, but it gives you the flexibility to say, hey, you know what? Yes, I just want this stuff residing on tape if that's what fits. But it's not an all or nothing. You may find yourself saying, yeah, we want some NAS jobs, still going to repository. We want other NAS jobs going directly to tape. But we also still have, the flexibility to easily achieve the 3-2-1 rule with tape. For those of you who are familiar with tape, you might be familiar with the term disk to tape, which is essentially moving data from disk to another disk, which would be a repository, and off to tape. So this is completely supported in V12. It's nice and easy to set up. And it's an easy way to achieve that 3-2-1 rule, right? You'll have 3 copies of your data, 2 of which will be on different medium, disk and tape, and 1 of which you'll be taking off-site, air-gapped, potentially even immutable, depending on the type of tape media that you're using. So it's a great way to streamline your efforts. There's also been tremendous enhancements to the Linux hardened repository. So if you're not familiar with this, this concept was introduced previously where you're able to leverage built-in file systems on a Linux host to provide a level of immutability. With V12, it's now its own dedicated repository type. Those of you with sharp eyes might notice on the right-hand side there's not even an option to uncheck immutable anymore. So this type of repository only supports immutability. And it's a great way to get immutability into your organization today, without having to go out and leverage third-party vendors such as a hyperscaler, or try and procure a new storage array that supports object storage. Now there are some best practices around this. First off, even though you can, it is highly, highly, highly discouraged to set this up as a virtual machine. The reason being is, although the guest OS itself, will be immutable when you set it up, the underlying data store won't be. So you could still have someone who gains access to, let's say, vCenter, go in there and actually just delete the machine, and all of a sudden your immutable repository is gone. And the same sort of logic applies to, if you were to try to use iSCSI or NFS share to actually mount this stuff within, a Linux operating system. So for those reasons, we highly, highly, highly recommend and stress that these should be physical boxes with a bunch of direct attached storage. That would give you the immutability that you need using XFS, and it'll give you the robustness that's really required to make sure that your data remains safe. So I won't read through this entire slide. It's really meant to be a bit of a cheat sheet with regards to where and when you can use immutability depending on the type of job. I do want to call it the first column, the direct to object. That's basically say, yes, you could just write directly to object without immutability. The third column, so the second from the right there, that one is actually to say, yes, you can write directly to object storage and use immutability. The one thing I would like to call out about this slide is if you take a look at the Linux hardened repository, you'll see that it's got a good amount of support across the board. So it really is designed to help customers of any size achieve that immutability, and hopefully a budget that fits the price range. So now that we've kind of talked about, okay, your backups are secure. So if disaster strikes, hopefully you're good to go. You've got a restore plan in place. Let's talk about locking things down a bit more, right? Preventing that attacker from getting access to the key infrastructure. With V12, there's now multi-factor authentication for the console. So if you're not familiar with multi-factor authentication, basically what it means is when a user goes to log in, they'll be prompted for a one-time password, which is typically a 6-digit code. This code will appear, commonly now on, an app on your smartphone, like Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator. To set this up within V12, it's actually quite straightforward. You can just go into the console. It's just a single checkbox, and the next time the user logs in, they'll see a screen very similar to what you see in the bottom right-hand corner there. All this means is basically they'll pull out their Authenticator app of choice, and then they will be able to scan it with the camera, and it will basically set up, pair the two devices, and start generating the codes. They would hit next, they'd enter the code to confirm that things are synced up, and away they would go. Now, every time they log in, they'll be prompted for that code. So it'll be that 2 factors now. But what about service accounts, right? So a lot of us use service accounts that are set up specifically for specific tasks. If need be, you can actually disable MFA on specific accounts. So keep that in mind, and I'll circle back to service accounts in a moment as there's improvements there. But one other thing I'd like to call out about this is if your VBR server is sitting, offline, that's to say it's not connected to the internet, this will still work as well. Internet access is not a requirement for MFA to work. So speaking of service accounts, we've also got support for group managed service accounts. This is a Microsoft Active Directory construct, and it's pretty cool in nature. So what it does is it allows you to create these specific accounts managed by Active Directory that stay within Active Directory. And what I mean by that is, if we're using these for application-aware image processing, when the Veeam goes to log into the guest OS to do things like backup Active Directory or SQL Server, it needs user credentials. Using these group managed service accounts, those credentials are not stored on the Veeam server. Rather, they're stored right within Active Directory. So you've got this additional layer of security now that's bundled right into Active Directory with a reduced attack surface. So there's a few really cool things about these accounts. So one, they cannot log on interactively, which basically means if someone managed to get the username and the password for these, they still would not be able to sit down at a console or fire up remote desktop and actually log in. Two, these passwords changed every 30 days. So security teams will love that, right? Just automated password rotation for your service accounts, because that's always been a real pain in the neck when it comes to using service accounts, is when the password does need to be changed, you gotta go find all the different spots that you've used it for. So that's all handled automatically now. And third, the passwords that are generated are 240 bytes long. So I haven't done the math on this. All I know is that 240 bytes, that's a long password, and I don't know if we actually have the computational power available today to crack a password of that length within a 30-day period. So it's really got the best of both worlds in that it gives you that great security, as well as with that hands-off management as far as the auto password rotation. If that's something that you're looking to set up, there are some prerequisites for it. You can find some of that on the Veeam Help Center pages, as well as from the Microsoft Docs site. Keeping with the security tone here, there's been a tremendous increase in where Kerberos is supported within the Veeam Data Platform. So why is this noteworthy? Well, a lot of conversations that we're having, particularly when security teams get involved, come around, hey, we need to make the environment as secure as possible. NT LAN Manager, NTLM, was the algorithms that were used way back when Active Directory was first introduced. And that's going on like 23, almost 25 years now. They are far from secure. So a lot of organizations are shifting towards Kerberos, which is significantly more secure. So depending on your current architecture and whatnot, you might be able to find yourself going to a full Kerberos environment now, and your backup software being Veeam won't be holding you back at all. A couple of quick tips about Kerberos if you are going that route. One, make sure that your DNS is rock solid. Kerberos relies very, very heavily on DNS, and small changes there can actually bring the whole thing down. And going hand in hand with that, make sure that your NTP is valid across the board. There are certain timeframes within which each clock, as far as the systems go with communication, must be in sync. So those two, although they're best practices for every environment should have good NTP and DNS. They are especially true when it comes to working with Kerberos. It's also worth noting that Kerberos requires Active Directory if you're not familiar with that. So that's to say, if you're just running in work group mode only, this is all somewhat irrelevant. Now, speaking of security, Kerberos, and so forth, Linux seems to always work its way into the security conversation, right? And that's not me just trying to start up the whole which OS is better or anything like that. Typically comes from security teams, A, wanting options, and B, traditionally, a lot of them like sort of the detailed, let's call it package management under a lot of Linux distributions, the ability to fine tune things and see exactly what's running in there. So with that in mind, there's been some definite enhancements and improvements with v12 and Linux. As we already saw, we got the Linux hardened repository. That's a real first-class citizen when it comes to storing your backups. Additionally, now with the Linux proxy, you can back up from storage snapshots for NFS. So if that's something you find useful, we're definitely seeing interest in that in the field right now. For Linux hardened repositories, you can now actually install the network block device proxy mode on there as well. So that's to say that, hey, you know what? You've got this Linux hardened repo. You'd like to get some more use out of it. It can now hold that proxy role as well. Speaking of the repository, XFS block cloning is enabled by default. So previously, yes, this was basically a simple checkbox that had to be checked, assuming that you're using XFS. It's now enabled by default, as frankly, it's a best practice. So it's one less thing for you to have to remember when you're deploying these. Additionally, Linux can now be used as a continuous data protection proxy. I'll dive into CDP a little bit later here, but once again, getting a little bit more utilization out of any Linux host that you might have in the environment. And lastly, it could be used as a tape server. To me, this one is actually quite key, especially when we start talking about DR and storing from tapes. So the cool thing with Linux and tape server support is, by and large, you don't need any additional drivers for tape drives within Linux. There are some handful of exceptions, but most of the time the kernel will actually have the drivers that you need already within the system. So why is that important? Well, anyone who's worked with tape, knows that sometimes the driver versions could be finicky, right? Especially when we're talking Windows, you need to have that proper pairing in place. If you find yourself in a situation where you are actually executing a DR plan and you need to restore from tape, hopefully you have a valid tape drive for whatever tape medium that you have. So if you have LTO 4 tapes from a few years ago, for example, for whatever reason that you need to restore, hopefully you actually have an LTO 4 drive. But then on top of that, you still need the drivers. From the Windows perspective, that could be a little kludgy, right? So if you're using this for Linux, that's one less thing to worry about. The other thing that's pretty cool with v12 is the tape catalog is now actually contained in the configuration backup. So when you perform a configuration backup of the Veeam backup and replication server, that tape catalog is now included in part of that. So if you find yourself having to do a restore of your VBR server, the tape catalog is there now too, which means you don't need to re-index all your tapes. So really just about providing some additional efficiencies, especially if you find yourself having to rebuild the tape catalog, you're probably not having a good day. So it's something I just wanted to touch on quickly here, although not new in v12, but this kind of goes back to the remark I made earlier about immutability doesn't necessarily stop data leakage, right? Somebody could copy data off. So how can you combat that? Well, for one, you could basically encrypt your backups. Veeam supported this for a long time, uses 256-bit AES, and the intention here is basically, if your backups are encrypted and somebody copies it off, well, they can't actually access it without having that decryption key. So if you're not familiar with it, encryption works on the source side. VBR basically reads the VM or whatever the file data is, encodes the data blocks, and transfers it to the target side in the encrypted format and stores that data in the file on the backup repository or tape. Decryption, on the other hand, is also performed on the source side. So VBR transfers encrypted data back to the source side and decrypts it there. Now, you can also add encryption to network traffic. So say you have traffic going between the primary site and the disaster recovery site. Network traffic encryption is actually configured as part of the global network traffic rules, and they're set for the various backup infrastructure components. So similarly, from an encryption standpoint, 256-bit AES is included there. So keep that in mind as you're having those security conversations with the various teams. So we've talked about securing your backups, securing access to your backup infrastructure. Let's talk about the next step, right? Monitoring and analytics. You want to keep an eye on things. You want to make sure that You've locked things down, doesn't mean there still can't be suspicious behavior. So from the Veeam Data Platform standpoint, one of the things that we leverage here is Veeam1. If you're not familiar with Veeam1, it's quite straightforward to set up and install. Requires a Windows OS to install it on, and it's made up of essentially two components. You've got the Veeam1 client, which is an application, and then you've also got the web UI. Cool thing about Veeam1 is it gives you all sorts of reporting. It's not just about reporting on your Veeam infrastructure. It can pull information from Windows through WMI. You can add your vSphere infrastructure, your Hyper-V infrastructure, and of course your Veeam infrastructure. You can start pulling all sorts of interesting monitoring dashboards and so forth from it. One of the interesting things about this is you can actually build out business groups as well. And what I mean by that is, let's say you've got a 3-tier application that consists of a database, a web server, and I don't know, maybe a file server. You want to be able to give that application owner visibility into how things are performing, when was the last backup, and so forth. Within Veeam1, you can actually create that as a group and then delegate those permissions to the user so they can actually go in there and check out the dashboards and all that sort of stuff, see how things are actually running. With V12, there's definitely been some new reports that have been released that really pertain to adding that data security into the mix. So the first one is the identify the workloads at risk. So this particular report has multiple pages to it, including high-level overview, as well as everything that's immutable. And then there's this page, the mutable workloads. So what does this mean? This basically identifies workloads that are at risk where they have backups that may not be immutable. That's not to say that's inherently bad. Maybe it does align to your business strategy, but it's worth reviewing this in case there's things on here that, maybe this really should be immutable, right? It's a good way to flag things. What's neat about this report is you may notice it's not just limited to, VMware vSphere backups, right? I've got NAS job in here. I've got some Windows agent servers in here. You could have Veeam agent for Linux servers in there as well. So it's really a bit of a holistic view to your environment, right? What's actually at risk and what should be protected. These are the type of reports that'd be fantastic to bring up to management, leadership level and say, here's everything at risk. Can you get the sign off on this that's okay, that it's not immutable? Or if it needs to be immutable, how do we solve that? Do we look at the Linux hardware repository? Do we look at storage? Do we look at hyperscalers and so forth? Something else you could do is you could be alerted to possible ransomware attacks. So what I love about this alert is it's highly customizable. You'll see here in the image, we basically customize it with if something's over 80% usage from the CPU perspective, throw an error, and if data store write usage is high or network transmission usage is high. And really what that allows you to do is build the granularity that you need. You can have multiple different versions of this alarm. You could change the scope on it. So you can say, yes, these applications run hot from the CPU perspective, but if the disk write goes up high, flag me, right? Because that's unusual. And why are we using these specific metrics? Well, when we're talking about ransomware, what's it do? It encrypts your data. Encryption traditionally is a very CPU heavy task because it involves a lot of computation. But as part of that, it's writing out a new encrypted file. So you'll see that fairly often with, those two go hand in hand, high CPU usage, high disk write usage, especially on machines that shouldn't be exhibiting this. That could be a good sign. Similarly, if you see high network usage, that might be a sign of maybe somebody's actually exfiltrating data, right? Going back to what I was saying earlier about somebody copying data off of one of the repositories. The other neat thing about this is you can actually customize your notifications and your responses, right? So here's an example of notifications. You could send it to a business view, which is one of those Veeam1 constructs, leverage SNMP, or you can run a script, right? Similarly, from the actions screenshot, the actions response, You could run the script. So you could say, hey, if this gets flagged, maybe automatically shut down this VM, or maybe disconnect it from the network and send me an email to let me know what's going on. Now that's all fine and dandy, but there's other things that might be going on, right? Well, if you have, that threat that's sitting in the network that's taking their time, they're slowly changing things, right? That's where things like the audit infrastructure changes job comes in. So this would be a great report to review regularly. In this case, it monitors your vSphere infrastructure, but it lets you very quickly identify what's changed, right? What's changed, when did it change, who changed it, and so forth. So there's a fair amount of detail in here. And what it lets you do is when you're reviewing this, you might be able to find some of those things that don't quite make sense, things that make your spidey sense tingle and say, hey, how come this happened on this date by this account? They were on vacation. Or why is so-and-so making changes at 2 a.m. in the morning? So once again, more data to allow you to actually figure out what's going on in the environment. So let's say disaster does hit, right? Obviously, we all want to minimize the amount of downtime that we have. We want to get things back up and running as quick as possible. Veeam's been known for its fast recovery for a long time, right? I'm sure a lot of you have seen very similar slides in the past. I remember years ago, this number was, I think, in the mid 40s, right? Now the v12, we're up to 105 different ways to actually get your data back. Now, I'm not going to stand here and read through all these, but I like to throw the slide out there to sort of show, yes, we are continually finding new ways to get your data back. So let's talk about what a typical restore will look like, right? Here we've got our primary site, which is made up of a few VMware hosts connected to a storage array. And let's say our critical apps are running and taking advantage of built-in technologies like high availability, storage snapshots, so forth. So most of us are already doing the minimum. We have backups in place, running to a secondary storage target that's immutable, right? Making a copy to maybe send that data off-site. So we've got 2 copies of it now, or maybe to the cloud, right? Just something to ensure that we're following that 3-2-1 data protection rule. So we should also be leveraging multi-factor authentication, which I touched on earlier, as well as service accounts, whether it's GMSA or maybe traditional service accounts, and really just making sure that we're defining the least amount of privilege required to access the system. So this setup works fine. It works perfectly for things like file deletions, bad upgrades, patches, and maybe even recovering applications locally fast. But it's still missing a bit of the larger picture, especially when we start talking about disaster recovery and security. So next, we really need to be thinking about the potential recovery locations in the event that any of these disasters completely take hold of our data centers. We need to think about things like the applications that require the least amount of downtime and ensure that they have the proper resources available to bring them back online. So the last thing you want to do is basically have things say, hey, we're going to fail over to the DR site, then realize, what, don't actually have the capacity there. So within Veeam Backup and Replication, we do have the power to do VM-based replication. It's in the name, right? And we can do that through a couple of different ways. We could do it through the sort of traditional replication, or we could use the continuous data protection if we need to make sure things are down to a few seconds. Similarly, we can also even just use storage snapshots as well. So that's another way to get the data over there. But let's talk about storage snapshots just a little bit more here, right? So you can actually replicate them from site A to site B. Then you can actually leverage things like a Veeam Explorer for storage snapshots. So in this example, let's say something happens in site A, or maybe you just don't have very long snapshot retention in site A, but you've got longer retention in site B. You can actually fire up the Veeam Explorer and go in there and pull out, whether it's files or VMs or whatever, right from the underlying storage array. So what's really cool about that is it's fast. Plain and simple. You're pulling stuff out from the storage system that it's going to land on. So it's going to be very, very quick. So I talked a little bit about CDP there. If you're not familiar with CDP, it's continuous data protection. And it leverages a technology from VMware called vSphere APIs for I/O, also known as VIO. In a nutshell, what it is it's built into the ESXi kernel, and it sits there and it's able to actually watch and see all of the reads and writes going back and forth between the VM and the underlying disk. Third-party partners that are vetted and trusted, such as Veeam, were able to leverage those APIs to do things like create our own CDP driver. So what we do with this driver is we install it onto the host in the cluster, and we say, hey, you know all those bits that you're able to read when it's reading and writing between the VM and storage array? Well, let's capture those. Let's capture those and send them somewhere else. So we're able to get replication down to seconds if need be, if you have the infrastructure to support it, which means that if you do need failover, things are fast, right? Your RPO and your RTO is going to be down to seconds, maybe minutes, versus where a lot of us are used to saying hours. So CDP has seen some enhancements in V12. Big one is it now supports 100 megabit networks. Now, hopefully, nobody on here is actually running 100 megabit on their LAN. If you are, it is what it is. But what this is really designed for is think about cases where maybe it's your WAN, right? Your external connection. Maybe you want to run CDP, from a branch office back to HQ, so forth. Or maybe you're using a Cloud Connect partner. So it really opens the door a bit there. So on top of things like the improved scalability, the faster failover, we've also, once again, painted that security brush on it, right? All communications encrypted as well. So there's still that security that's inherently baked into this. So if you find yourself using CDP, know that that connection is secure. Now, speaking of quick recovery, instant recovery for SMB shares. So if you find yourself needing to, let's say, one of your SMB shares is down, file server's down, whatever the case might be, how do you get your users back up and running quickly? Well, with instant recovery for SMB shares, it's very similar to what we've had for years where we pioneered instant VM recovery. What it does is it basically mounts the share from the backup repository. So in this case here, you'll see the user will actually connect to the instant recovery share, which is hosted from the backup repository. Then what happens in the background is we start the migration process, just like we would with the VM and storage vMotion and so forth. So as that's going on, we find, hey, you know what? Things are good, things are synced. We actually dismount the instant recovery share from the backup repository. The user gets disconnected and then reconnected to the production share. So yes, there is that slight disconnect, but what's really neat is if you leverage Windows DFS, so distributed file system, you can actually make this whole process, quite transparent to users. If you're able to have that one name set up for the share and have them point to that and add the instant recovery share to that DFS share, users may never even notice that swap over. So it's pretty cool to be able to get large volumes set up like that. So that's all fine for when we're doing recovery for specific VMs or specific file shares. But what happens when you need to recover at scale? So let's go back to this diagram that we looked at earlier, right? So things like keeping updated documentation for how DR changes, ensuring plans can be executed to meet the needs of the business, that's absolutely crucial. So that's where the Veeam Recovery Orchestrator comes in. Not only can we quickly test and verify that our DR plans are meeting our service level agreements, that they're not missing RPOs or RTOs, we can also leverage tools like CleanDR to automatically scan a VM and agent backups with a antivirus solution of your choice to make sure that the data that's being restored back is actually clean. And the cool thing is, while this is all going on, it'll be dynamic reporting that's kept up to date as well. And I mentioned data freedom, right? So it's your data, it's your responsibility. So we differentiate that by giving customers the freedom of choice to avoid vendor or technology lock-in, right? So you've got the total ownership and control with the flexibility of how you want to recover. So if you don't have that, let's say, secondary VMware site like we do here, you still have options for your workloads. You can recover them in Azure, right? Making Veeam a very fluid solution for like the hybrid cloud. So in this example, it's not expressly called out, but you can actually restore your agents back into Azure if you need to. So what is clean DR, right? So it's orchestrated secure restore. If you're familiar with secure restore, that's basically the process that we have in place to scan the restore image as it's going on to say, hey, you know what, do the restore, do an AV scan, is there anything malicious in there? The cool thing with VRO is that it basically orchestrates all that. So if it finds, hey, yes, this is in fact infected, move on to the next one automatically, keep going until you basically find a clean one. So it does support several antivirus solutions in Windows OS. We've actually got some KBs and stuff on how you might be able to add other ones that are not included out of the box. And it works both with vSphere and agent backups. If you're not familiar with agent could be deployed on physical workloads, it could be deployed on virtual machines, laptops. The end point that I'm driving at here is that you can actually take your physical backups and restore them to Azure or to vSphere if you need to. So think about that from a DR perspective. So how does clean DR work, right? Let's say you've got multiple restore points here, and you say, you know what? Yeah, let's start going through them. So we'll mount the disks directly from the backup file to the mount server. Then from there, start the antivirus check. Things start going through. Cool, no infections are found, just continue to restore, right? Pop it into the hypervisor, power that on. But what happens if an infection is found? So we can either proceed to the next available restore point and basically repeat till we find a clean one. Or what's also handy is you might say, you know what, stop the restore or complete the restore and connect the VM to a quarantine network. So you might use this in situations where you need to get that VM online. Even if it's not connected to the network, maybe you want to look at something from a forensic standpoint. Maybe you need to verify something in there, even though it's already been compromised. So it gives you that flexibility that you need. And lastly, where do you want to restore to? It could be a VM, or you could restore to Azure into that quarantine network. So similar to this, we got the cloud DR, right? So this is the orchestrated direct restore, right? So this is where you say, you know what, we've got nowhere on premises to restore to. We need to restore everything into Azure. Data center's gone. Maybe law enforcement sees that as part of the investigation, right? You don't have it. This is your solution to get that orchestration going there, to know that you can actually still get your environment up and running, even if you don't actually have your data center to restore it to. So as part of this, you'll actually be able to see your dashboard for RPOs and RTOs. And this is the type of stuff that's absolutely critical to enterprises from a risk management standpoint. If I am telling them from the IT perspective, yes, we'll be able to get things back up and running within 4 hours. Let's just throw a number out there. Not only will this dashboard tell me how I'm doing in real time if I'm actually running this event, I can actually run sandbox versions of this event. So that's to say it will actually go through and perform all of these required tasks, but in a sandbox environment. So it'll go through, it'll restore the VMs, it'll power them up, but they won't be connected to the production network. So why do we care about that? Why is that important? Well, that's extremely important because it's a true test, right? If it goes through and says, yes, I did all of these steps, in under 4 hours, you get a green check mark, you know that if you need to do that in production, in real time, you'll get the same results because you're using the same underlying plans, underlying infrastructure. So it's extremely valuable in that regard. So I've mentioned the Veeam Data Platform a lot. Folks who have been Veeam customers for a while, or maybe just tuned into the launch event for the first time back in February. This messaging might be new. What is this Veeam Data Platform? Well, at the end of the day, the Veeam Data Platform is really, a set of outcomes, right? We're going to focus on the middle bars here. Depending on what you're using, what features, what products, these three things are somewhat relevant or exist within all three. But at the end of the day, they do kind of tie in specifically, more so to specific products. So, at the foundation, we've got the secure backup and fast recovery, because at the end of the day, that's really what absolutely every organization needs, right? You need to make sure that you can actually roll back your backups, get out of trouble, get out of jam, and do it quickly. As I alluded to earlier, that's a great first step. You want to make sure that you're secure, but you also want to make sure that you keep monitoring things. You want to stay on top of things. You want to be alerted as soon as not only do things go wrong, you want to see what can I do to actually proactively fix them, right? That's where tools like Veeam come in. And that's all fine and dandy, but what happens when things happen at scale, right? Whether it's a ransomware attack that spreads like wildfire, or maybe it's that dreaded, pipe burst in the data center, took out several racks, or you know what? Many of us have been there, right? Backhoes outside and kills fiber connection. That's still a DR event. And that's where proper orchestration, proven orchestration, that's really where that value is. So that's all to say that, we've got the foundation, the advanced, and the premium editions. And this is how they align from a product perspective. Foundation is a Veeam backup and recovery. Backup and replication. The advanced is the same thing, includes Veeam 1. You've got the premium edition, which includes Veeam backup and replication, Veeam 1, and Veeam recovery orchestrator. We've also had a lot of questions around the ransomware warranty that was introduced as part of the v12 launch. So with that, you will need, the premium edition, and still a separate add-on. We've got lots of information on our webpage about terms and conditions. If you have a channel partner that you work with, reach out to them for more information. If you have a sales team to work with, reach out to them for more information. They're more than happy to answer whatever questions you may have. So with that being said, reaching the end here, thank you all for sticking around and listening. I'll take the next few minutes here to go through some questions here. If I don't get to all the questions, I'll try to reach out after the fact. But yeah, I'll get going. So I'll read out a few here. So are there any specific hardware or software requirements for the Linux hardened repository? So great question. I did touch on the fact that it shouldn't be a VM, or you should make sure that you're running some local disk in there. But from a hardware perspective, you'll want to ensure that you're running something that has all the required drivers for whatever distribution you end up going with. We also do recommend a reliable hardware RAID card as opposed to like a software RAID card. From a software perspective, the Linux distribution does need to be 64-bit due to the Veeam data mover requirements, but full list distributions can be found on the systems requirements guide on veeam.com. By no offhand releases, of recent distributions for things like Oracle, DB, and Ubuntu, they're supported. From a security perspective, we never put our Veeam backup and replication server on an Active Directory domain in order to create a security boundary. With GMSA, should we reconsider? So GMSA has definitely brought in some tremendous improvements from a security perspective. To your point, having separation for your production domain is still a best practice. We do see a lot of customers do it. What we do see a lot of customers do is actually build out a new Active Directory domain dedicated to the backup infrastructure, and then actually use a one-way transitive trust to allow access from the management domain back into the production domain. So the Veeam Best Practices Guide actually covers this under, I think it's the security domains section. If you're not familiar with the guide, you can actually find it at BP, so that's as in best practice, so bp.veeam.com. With VBR v12, our SQL Server configuration database is still supported. Do we need to migrate to Postgres? So SQL Server is absolutely still supported. If you're performing a fresh install of v12, you can select to use Postgres SQL right out of the box. If you are upgrading to v12, you can find the migration steps within Help Center, so helpcenter.veeam.com. The cool thing is you can actually migrate back and forth. So if you do make the move, let's say going from SQL to Postgres, and you decide, you know what, this isn't for us for whatever reason, you can actually move back. And then down the road, you decide you want to move again, you can go back the other way again. So it is fully supported. And yeah, you can find the documentation on the site. So with that, I am going to wrap things up. I'll see if I could get a few more questions answered here. But thank you all very much for joining, and hope you found this informative. Thank you.
Okay, and one last reminder about the links in your handouts. You can find the free trials and demos, among other things, in there. So grab those before we close the event here. Well, I want to thank Matt for putting together a really informative presentation, for all of your insights in the Q&A there. We really appreciate your time today. And there were some questions, as Matt mentioned, that we couldn't get to today, but he's trying to answer some of those, and we'll pass on the others to the team at Veeam for possible follow-up. So before we wrap up, we have one more piece of business. It's the Amazon gift card prize drawing, and the winner of that $250 Amazon gift card today is Alex Avakian from California. So congratulations to Alex. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Veeam for making this event possible, and thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.